The moment Sarah Mitchell's boot slipped on the ice-slicked rock, Nathaniel felt it. A violent wrench in his chest like a fishhook catching flesh. 234 years of existing as something between shadow and smoke, and still the sensation of another human soul about to be torn from the mountain hit him like the bullet that had killed his brother Daniel in 1790. She was falling. Not the theatrical tumble of someone who would catch themselves, but the silent, bone-shattering kind, where the body goes limp with the certainty of death. 40 feet of Pennsylvania granite waited below, jagged and hungry. Nathaniel moved without thinking, his form condensing from the November mist that clung to the Allegheny Ridge, materializing just long enough to wrap spectral fingers around her jacket. The fabric was real beneath his touch for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds where he wasn't a mountain wraith, wasn't the thing that made hikers' skin crawl with unexplained dread, wasn't the whispered warning park rangers shared over campfires. 3 seconds where he was just a man trying to save a life. Then the familiar agony shot through him, the price of touching the living world, and he screamed without sound as Sarah landed hard on a narrow ledge instead of the rocks below. She would wake with bruises shaped like fingerprints around her shoulders, bruises that would fade to silver scars she'd trace on sleepless nights, wondering, and Nathaniel would retreat back into the frozen fog that had been his home since the winter of 1791, when his own blood had painted these stones red and bound him here forever. But something was different this time. As consciousness seeped back into Sarah's eyes, she looked directly at him. Not through him, not past him, at him. Her lips formed a single word that made his long-dead heart convulse with something he'd forgotten the name for. Stay. And for the first time in 2 centuries, Nathaniel Frost wondered if damnation might have an expiration date. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. The Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania hold secrets in their ancient folds, like a grandmother clutching photographs of the dead. Nathaniel Frost had become one of those secrets, a story told incorrectly, a name misremembered, a warning wrapped in the comfortable dismissal of folklore. He existed in the liminal spaces where the tree line met sky, where morning mist refused to burn off even under August sun, where hikers reported feeling watched by something that carried the weight of centuries in its gaze. Mountain wraith. The term had evolved over time, whispered by the Lenape who first walked these ridges, then the European settlers who built their lives on borrowed land, then the modern adventurers with their GPS devices and satellite phones who still couldn't explain the cold that had nothing to do with elevation. Nathaniel had been many things before becoming this: a brother, a son, a man who believed in the young nation's promise of new beginnings. But that was before the winter that wouldn't end, before the hunger that turned men into wolves, before Daniel's blood steamed in the snow and Nathaniel made a choice that damned him. Now he was the mountain's memory, its conscience, its curse. He kept count of the years by the changing technology the hikers carried, muskets to rifles, lanterns to flashlights, paper maps to glowing screens. 234 winters watching life continue without him, each season layering ice over the wound that would never heal. Until Sarah Mitchell's boot slipped, until her eyes saw him, until one word cracked the frost around his dead heart with the force of spring thaw. The cold never bothered Nathaniel anymore, a bitter irony considering cold had killed him. He drifted through the November morning in his preferred form, something between smoke and shadow, observing the hikers who'd arrived before dawn to catch sunrise from the summit. Sarah Mitchell wasn't among them. She'd come alone 3 hours later, and that solitary quality had drawn his attention first. Most humans traveled these trails in groups, their voices too loud, their fear of silence palpable. But Sarah moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd chosen isolation, her footsteps deliberate on the frost-rimed path. She was 28, though Nathaniel couldn't have said how he knew this with such certainty. Perhaps 2 centuries of observing the living had taught him to read age in the way shoulders carried weight, in the particular set of a jaw that had weathered disappointment but not yet hardened against hope. He'd followed her without intention, the way mist follows topography. She stopped often to photograph the landscape with a camera that seemed expensive, professional. Each time she paused, Nathaniel found himself wondering what she saw through that lens, whether the mountains looked beautiful to her or merely wild, whether she could sense the accumulated grief in these ancient stones. The Allegheny Ridge had witnessed every flavor of human suffering, the forced removal of the Lenape, the brutal winters of early settlement, the industrial scarring of the coal boom, the quiet, modern desperation of towns that progress had forgotten. Nathaniel had watched it all, powerless to intervene, a ghost pinned to the place of his dying like a butterfly under glass. When Sarah reached Widow's Drop, a granite outcrop that jutted over the valley like an accusing finger, she set up her tripod at the edge, too close to the edge. Nathaniel felt the warning tighten in his chest, that peculiar pull that came when death approached his mountain. He'd felt it hundreds of times, the hunter who would trigger a rock slide, the child who would wander from camp and freeze, the depressed accountant who would choose jumping over, returning to a life that felt like suffocation. Sometimes Nathaniel intervened, materializing just enough to create an unexplained sound that drew attention elsewhere, a cold breeze that made people step back from danger. Other times he simply watched, bearing witness because someone should, because the mountain demanded that these endings not go unnoticed. But Sarah's fall came without warning, a patch of black ice where morning sun hadn't reached, physics betraying her in the space between heartbeats. Nathaniel moved on instinct, pulling himself into partial solidity through sheer force of will. The transformation hurt. God, it always hurt. Like cramming a hurricane into a bottle, like teaching stone to bend, like demanding that death reverse itself just for a moment. His fingers closed around her jacket, real fabric, real woman, real life, and he yanked her toward the ledge with strength that surprised them both. The contact cost him. Pain erupted through his spectral form like wildfire through dry timber. This was the price of touching the living world. Agony that rewrote nerve endings he no longer possessed, that reminded him in exquisite detail exactly what it felt like to be flesh and blood and breakable. He'd endured it before, but never for this long. 3 seconds. 3 eternal seconds where every moment of his death replayed in fast forward. The musket ball punching through his chest, Daniel's scream, the snow turning red, the cold that started in his lungs and spread outward until it was all he was. Then it released him, and Sarah was safe on the narrow ledge and Nathaniel was dissolving back into mist. He should have retreated completely, should have faded into the mountain's bones and let her think she'd imagined whatever had just happened. That was the pattern, the rule he'd followed for 2 centuries. Intervene if necessary, but never be seen, never be known, never allow hope to poison his eternal isolation. But Sarah's eyes opened, and they found him. Not the space where he'd been, not the general area of unexplained cold, but him. Nathaniel felt the weight of that gaze like sunlight on skin he no longer had. She was bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow, her breathing shallow with shock, but her focus was absolute. Her lips moved, forming the word that would change everything. Stay. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the valley below, a train whistled its lonesome call. A crow took flight from a nearby pine, its wings cutting through silence thick as amber. And Nathaniel Frost, who had not made a choice of his own volition since 1791, chose to remain visible. His form solidified slowly, painfully, like ice forming in reverse. First just an outline, then the suggestion of features, then something approaching human shape. He appeared as he'd died, 32 years old, dark hair frosted with eternal winter, eyes the color of January sky before snow. The musket ball wound in his chest was visible, a dark stain that never stopped spreading, that never finished killing him. He wore the clothes of his death, wool breeches, linen shirt, a coat that had belonged to his father. "You're real," Sarah whispered. Her voice shook, but not with fear. Wonder, maybe, or shock. When I was falling, I thought I imagined, you should go." Nathaniel's voice came from somewhere between wind and memory, carrying an accent that marked him as colonial era, that revealed the careful education his family had scrimped to provide. "The trail back is dangerous. You're bleeding. You saved me. The mountain did. I'm just part of it now." Sarah pushed herself to sitting, wincing. The ledge was barely 3 feet wide, a temporary mercy before the long drop continued below. "What are you?" The question he'd hoped no one would ever ask directly, the question he'd rehearsed 1,000 answers for in the endless silent years. "A mistake that won't die." That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. He was already fading, the effort of maintaining form too costly. "There's a path, 20 feet north. It'll take you back to the main trail." "Wait." Sarah reached toward him, and Nathaniel flinched backward so violently he nearly lost cohesion entirely. "I'm sorry, I won't. I just want to understand." "Understanding won't help you. Go home. Forget this." But even as he spoke the words, Nathaniel knew they were lies. He could see it in her eyes, the stubborn set of curiosity that wouldn't be dismissed, the same quality that had brought her alone to dangerous heights to photograph beauty most people missed. She would not forget. And some traitorous part of him, buried under centuries of ice, didn't want her to. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said, as if offering information could somehow balance the cosmic scales between them. "I'm a photographer. I've been documenting the Allegheny Trail system for 2 years. I've heard the stories about this ridge, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched, the missing hikers." 3, Nathaniel said before he could stop himself. 3 went missing in my time here. One was already dead from exposure when I found him. One wanted to disappear. The third— He paused, the memory bitter as hemlock. "The third I couldn't save. But you saved me. I shouldn't have." The admission came out harsh, cracked at the edges. "Every time I touch the living world it costs. Every interaction pulls me closer to something I can't afford to want." "What do you want?" The question hung between them like frost crystallizing in air. What did he want? To rest. To forget. To stop counting years by their accumulating weight. To hear his brother's laugh one more time. To be forgiven for the unforgivable. To die completely instead of being trapped in this half-state of existence. To be seen. To matter. To not be alone. "To warn you," he said instead. "A storm's coming. The weather service won't predict it, but I can feel it in the mountain's bones. You need to descend before it hits." Sarah checked her phone. No signal, as expected at this elevation, then looked back at him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. "Will I see you again?" "No." "You're a terrible liar for a ghost." "I'm not a ghost." The words came out defensive, sharp. "Ghosts are echoes. I'm something worse." Before she could respond, before his resolve could weaken further, Nathaniel let himself dissolve completely. He retreated into the mountain's embrace, spreading himself thin across rock and root and frozen ground. From this dispersed state, he watched Sarah stand carefully, test her weight on the ledge, then begin the slow climb to the path he'd indicated. She moved methodically, professionally, but kept glancing back to where he'd been, looking for him, expecting him. The storm he'd warned about rolled in 3 hours later, just as Sarah reached the parking lot. Nathaniel felt it building, the particular electricity in the air, the way the mountains seemed to hunker down in anticipation. From his diffused perspective, he watched her drive away in a Jeep with Pennsylvania plates, equipment rattling in the back. He told himself that would be the last time, that he'd return to his comfortable pattern of observation without attachment, of intervention without connection. He'd done his good deed. The mountain's ledger was balanced. But that night, as sleet hammered the ridge and wind screamed through the pines, Nathaniel found himself condensing into form in the place where Sarah had fallen. The cold didn't bother him, but the loneliness did. And for the first time in decades, he noticed the difference. He stood at Widow's Drop, looking down at the valley lights scattered like dropped stars. Somewhere down there, Sarah was probably warm, probably safe, probably already forgetting about the strange encounter on the mountain. That's what people did. They survived, they rationalized, they moved on. But the word she'd spoken, "stay," echoed in the chambers of his chest where a heart had once beat. Such a simple request, such an impossible gift to give. The wind picked up, and in its howl, Nathaniel heard another voice. His brother Daniel, dead for 200 years but never silent, never at rest. You broke the rule, Nate. I saved her life. You let her see you. That's different. That's dangerous. Nathaniel turned, and there was Daniel, or the ghost of Daniel, the true ghost, the echo that Nathaniel's guilt had refused to let fade. He appeared as he died, 29 years old, musket ball through his throat, eyes wide with the betrayal that death had been. They'd been hunting, him and Nathaniel, starving, desperate. That terrible winter of 1791 when the snow never stopped, and the game disappeared and their settlement had burned to the ground after a raid. They'd tracked a deer for 3 days, and when they finally cornered it, they'd fought over who would take the shot. Daniel had raised his musket. Nathaniel had pushed the barrel aside. The weapon discharged, and the ball ricocheted off a rock into Daniel's throat. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came after, when Daniel lay bleeding in the snow and Nathaniel had a choice: try to save his brother and likely fail, or take the deer, fresh killed in the struggle, and survive the winter. He'd hesitated. God forgive him, he'd hesitated 3 seconds too long. Daniel had died watching Nathaniel choose. That choice had damned him. The mountain itself seemed to reach up through the snow and claim Nathaniel's soul before his own death came hours later, from cold and grief, and a guilt that stopped his heart more effectively than any bullet. He'd woken at dawn, frozen to the ground, and realized he was trapped. Not alive, not dead, not ghost. Something else. Something that would haunt these ridges forever, bearing witness to the spot where he'd valued survival over love. "She'll come back," Daniel said, his voice the sound of wind through empty spaces. "They always come back when they see you, and it always ends the same. This is different." That's what you said about Rebecca Harlow. The name hit like a slap. Rebecca Harlow, the historian who'd been researching mountain folklore 20 years ago. Nathaniel had let her glimpse him twice, had even spoken to her once. She'd become obsessed, returning week after week, demanding answers about the settlement, about the disappearances, about the cold spots and strange lights. And when Nathaniel had finally told her the truth about what he was, about what he'd done, she'd looked at him with such horror that he'd retreated for 5 years. He'd learned later she'd published a book dismissing all supernatural accounts as misidentified natural phenomena and local legend. She'd rationalized him away to protect her own sanity. "Sarah's different," Nathaniel insisted. "Because she said one word? Because she looked at you?" Daniel's laugh was cruel as frostbite. "You're pathetic, brother. 200 years, and you're still desperate for absolution you don't deserve. And you're still angry about 3 seconds of hesitation. 3 seconds that killed me." They'd had this argument countless times, in countless variations. Daniel's ghost was Nathaniel's punishment, or perhaps his conscience, or perhaps just another manifestation of his own guilt given spectral form. Either way, the presence never left, never forgave, never let him forget. "I'm going to talk to her again," Nathaniel said. The decision surprised him even as he spoke it. "If she comes back." "She will," Daniel said, "and you'll regret it." "I already regret everything. What's one more mistake?" The ghost dissolved into sleet. But not before Nathaniel heard the whispered response. "This one might actually kill what's left of you." 4 days passed. The storm system moved through, dumping 14 inches of snow on the higher elevations. Nathaniel watched hikers come and go. A couple in matching fleece jackets arguing about directions. A group of college students badly prepared for the conditions. A solo elderly man who moved with the confidence of someone who'd walked these trails for decades. None of them was Sarah. On the 5th day he felt her return. The sensation was unmistakable, a warmth moving up the mountain, life approaching like spring melt. His entire being oriented toward her location before conscious thought engaged. She was taking the southern approach this time, the longer but less technical route. Smart. Nathaniel debated his options. He could hide, could let her search and not find, could teach her through absence that the mountain kept its secrets. That would be the kind thing, the right thing. But he found himself condensing into form at their meeting place, Widow's Drop, where her blood still stained the rock in a pattern only he could see. She arrived an hour before sunset, breathing hard from the climb, cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. This time she carried less equipment, but moved with more purpose. When she saw him standing at the edge, fully visible, fully formed, she didn't startle, just nodded like she'd expected exactly this. "I brought something," Sarah said, shrugging off her backpack. She pulled out a thermos and 2 cups. "I know you probably can't drink coffee, but I thought, I don't know, it seemed like the thing to do." The gesture was so unexpectedly human that Nathaniel felt something crack in his chest. "I can't. Food, drink. The living world doesn't work that way for me anymore." "But you can hold things. You grabbed my jacket. At a cost." "What kind of cost?" He gestured to himself, to his half-present form. "This takes effort. Touching solid matter takes more. Affecting real change in the physical world, that takes everything, and it hurts like dying over and over." Sarah poured coffee into 1 cup, then settled onto a relatively flat rock. She wrapped her hands around the warmth, watching him with those direct, assessing eyes. "Tell me your name." "Why?" "Because I've been having conversations with you in my head all week, and mysterious mountain ghost is getting cumbersome." "Wraith," he corrected automatically. "Not a ghost." "What's the difference?" "Ghosts are echoes of the dead. Wraiths are the dead who refuse to finish dying." He paused, then offered what she'd asked for. "Nathaniel Frost." "When did you die, Nathaniel Frost?" "January 17th, 1791. I was 32 years old. I'd been in Pennsylvania for 3 years, trying to build a life after the Revolutionary War." Sarah did the math in her head. He could see her working through it. 234 years. Give or take. That's... She trailed off, searching for words. Lonely. The simple observation hit harder than accusation would have. "Yes. Is that why you saved me? Because you're lonely?" "I saved you because letting you die felt wrong." Nathaniel moved closer, his form more solid now, the effort less painful in her presence for reasons he didn't understand. "I've saved others before, but I didn't let them see me. I didn't—" He stopped, uncertain how to finish. "You didn't stay," Sarah completed. "Why did you stay for me?" "I don't know." The admission felt dangerous, like exposing a wound. "You asked, and I couldn't make myself leave." She sipped her coffee, and he watched the ritual with something like hunger, the steam rising, the warmth seeping into cold hands, the small comfort of a hot drink in mountain air, all things he would never experience again. "I researched you," Sarah said, "after I got home. I spent 3 days in the County Historical Society, going through old records. There was a settlement near here in the 1790s called Frost Hollow." Nathaniel's form flickered. "You shouldn't have done that." 2 brothers came from Massachusetts, Nathaniel and Daniel Frost. They were trying to establish a trading post, but the winter of 1791 was brutal. The settlement burned, records unclear why. One brother's body was found in spring, the other was never recovered. She looked up at him. "You're the one they didn't find." Partially correct. He forced himself to remain visible despite the urge to flee. "They found my body, or what was left of it. They buried it somewhere on this ridge. I don't remember exactly where. But I was already here by then, already trapped." "What trapped you?" This was it. The question that led to the truth that would make her leave, the same truth that had driven Rebecca Harlow to rationalize him away, the truth that Daniel's ghost whispered every day, "You don't deserve peace, you don't deserve forgiveness, you deserve exactly this." But looking at Sarah, at the genuine curiosity in her eyes, the lack of judgment, the willingness to sit on a freezing rock drinking coffee while talking to a dead man, Nathaniel found he was tired of lying, tired of hiding, tired of 2 centuries of silence. "I killed my brother," he said. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah didn't gasp, didn't recoil, didn't immediately offer platitudes. She just waited. So, Nathaniel told her. About the terrible winter, about the hunger that became a living thing, about tracking the deer for days, about the argument, the struggle, the musket discharging, about Daniel bleeding in the snow while Nathaniel stood frozen, not with cold, but with a choice. Save his dying brother or take the deer that would mean survival. I hesitated, Nathaniel said, his voice cracking at the edges. 3 seconds. That's all it was. But they were the 3 seconds that mattered. I stood there trying to decide, and Daniel died looking at me, knowing I'd chosen wrong, knowing I'd valued my own life over his. Did you take the deer? No. By the time I moved, by the time I dropped beside him and tried to stop the bleeding, it was too late, for him and for me. I froze to death that night, sitting next to his body. And when I woke the next morning, still here, still conscious, but not alive, I understood. This was my punishment. To watch life continue, to see people make the same choices I made and never be able to intervene, to be alone forever with what I'd done. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Wind moved through the pines, carrying the smell of approaching night. Finally, she asked, "Did you love your brother, more than anything? And you've spent 200 years torturing yourself over 3 seconds of human hesitation." "I killed him." "You didn't pull the trigger. The musket discharged in a struggle. And then you had 3 seconds to make an impossible choice while in shock and probably injured yourself. That's not murder, Nathaniel. That's tragedy. Tell that to Daniel. Is he here?" Sarah looked around, and Nathaniel realized she couldn't see the other ghost, the one that haunted him constantly. Always. "What does he say?" "That I don't deserve forgiveness, that I should suffer. That every moment of these 2 centuries is payment for 3 seconds of cowardice." Sarah set down her coffee cup and stood. She walked to the edge of Widow's Drop, looking out over the valley where lights were beginning to appear in windows. "You saved my life," she said. "You didn't hesitate. When I was falling, you didn't stop to calculate costs or consequences. You just acted. That's different. Is it? Or is it what you would have done for Daniel if you could do it over? If you had another chance?" She turned to face him. "You've had 200 years to prove you're the monster you think you are. Instead, you've saved people. You've warned them. You've borne witness to every life lost on this mountain, like they matter, like their stories deserve to be remembered. That's not a monster, Nathaniel. That's someone trying to atone. Atonement doesn't erase what I did. No, but maybe it earns you the right to stop punishing yourself." The suggestion was so radical, so impossible that Nathaniel laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "You don't understand. I'm bound here. The mountain won't let me go until—" He stopped, because he didn't actually know what would release him. In 2 centuries, he'd never discovered the mechanism of his curse, the specific terms of his damnation. "Until you forgive yourself," Sarah suggested gently. "That's not how curses work." "How do you know? Have you tried?" Before Nathaniel could answer, before he could explain all the ways he'd already tried to break free, a scream echoed up from the lower trail. The sound was young, terrified, cut short by distance and wind. Both he and Sarah turned toward it instantly. "Someone's in trouble," Sarah said, already moving. Nathaniel expanded his awareness, spreading his consciousness across the mountain. There, half a mile down the southern route, just beyond Eagle Pass, a teenage girl, injured, alone. And something worse, the temperature was dropping fast, a cold snap moving in that would kill her within hours. "Emma Kowalski," he said, the knowledge arriving with the certainty that came from his bond with the mountain. 16 years old, separated from her youth group, broken ankle, hypothermia setting in. "Can you help her?" "Not alone. I can guide you to her, but I can't carry her out. You'd need—" He calculated distances, temperatures, the girl's deteriorating condition. "We'd need the park ranger, Thomas Chen. He's still at the station, about to head home. Can you reach him? Not without—" Nathaniel paused. He could do it. He could manifest solidly enough to trigger motion sensors, to create disturbances that would alert Chen, but the cost would be enormous, and he'd just expended considerable energy maintaining form for this conversation with Sarah. Sarah seemed to read his hesitation. "What do you need?" "I need you to go down there. Get to Emma, keep her warm, stabilize her. I'll get Chen and guide him to you, but Sarah—" He caught her gaze, needing her to understand. "This will take everything I have. I won't be able to maintain form for days, maybe weeks after. You won't see me again." That's what you said last time. This is different. This is... He gestured helplessly at himself. I'll barely exist for a while. And even after I recover, I shouldn't. I shouldn't keep appearing to you, keep letting this, whatever this is, continue. Because it's too dangerous, too costly. Because I'm dead, Sarah. I've been dead for 234 years, and you're alive. You deserve to live your life with people who can actually be present for it, who can grow and change and... The words stuck in his throat. Who won't damn you through association? Another scream from the lower trail, weaker this time. Sarah grabbed her backpack and handed Nathaniel the thermos. Hold this. He took it instinctively, and the familiar pain shot through him, but less than before somehow. The metal was warm from her hands, and that warmth seemed to make the effort more bearable. When I come back, Sarah said, meeting his eyes with an intensity that pinned him in place, we're going to have a real conversation about what you think you deserve versus what you've actually earned. Deal? Sarah? Deal? The scream came again. They were out of time for debate. Deal, Nathaniel said. Sarah took off down the trail at a run, her headlamp cutting through the gathering dark. Nathaniel watched her go, then turned his attention to the ranger station 3 miles away. This would hurt. This would cost him weeks of recovery, weeks of existing as barely more than a thought drifting through stone. But Emma Kowalski was 16 years old, and she didn't deserve to die on his mountain. Nathaniel gathered himself, pulling his dispersed essence into a tight knot of intention. Then he threw himself toward the ranger station like a stone from a sling. The transition was agony. Moving this far, this fast, while maintaining enough cohesion to affect the physical world, it was like being torn apart and reassembled wrong. He manifested in the ranger station's parking lot just as Thomas Chen was locking up for the night. Chen was 45, 15 years on the job, skeptical of every ghost story ever told about these mountains. This would take precision. Nathaniel triggered the motion sensor lights. Once, twice, 3 times in a pattern no animal would create. Chen paused, hand on his truck door, frowning. Nathaniel moved to the station door and wrenched it open, the physical contact burning through him like acid, then slammed it shut. The sound echoed across the parking lot. Chen turned, hand moving to the radio on his belt. Hello? Station's closed. If you need help. Nathaniel gathered the last of his strength and threw the thermos, still warm from Sarah's coffee, against the station window. The metal struck glass with a sharp crack that made Chen jump. But more importantly, it left condensation on the window, and in that condensation, Nathaniel used the dregs of his power to write 2 words: Eagle Pass. The effort shattered him. Nathaniel felt his consciousness splinter, spread thin across the mountain like first frost. He tried to hold on, tried to maintain enough awareness to guide Chen to Emma and Sarah, but the cost was too high. He was dissolving, fragmenting, becoming less than thought. His last coherent image before scattering completely was of Sarah's face, the way she'd looked at him when she'd asked him to stay. Not with fear or pity, but with something that felt dangerously close to understanding. Then even that faded, and Nathaniel Frost ceased to exist as anything more than a cold breath moving through the mountain's bones. Time passed strangely when he existed like this, dispersed, diffused, more idea than entity. Nathaniel drifted through layers of stone and root, barely conscious, unable to form thought beyond the most basic impressions. Cold, dark, alone. The mountain's heartbeat, slow and patient. The whisper of water moving through underground channels. The dreams of hibernating animals, sluggish and peaceful. Sometimes he caught fragments of the living world above, voices on the trail, the rumble of vehicles in the parking lot, the sharp crack of rifles during hunting season, but they were distant, meaningless, disconnected from anything he could still call self. Gradually, days or weeks he couldn't tell, sensation returned, the ability to think in something approaching linear fashion. The awareness that he was Nathaniel Frost, that he had been something more than this scattered nothing. Memory assembled itself in pieces. Daniel's death, the curse. Sarah Mitchell asking him to stay. Emma Kowalski screaming in the dark. Had they saved her? Had Chen found them? The not knowing pulled at him, gave him something to coalesce around. Slowly, painfully, Nathaniel began to gather himself. The first thing he managed was sight, or his equivalent of it, the ability to perceive the mountain and everything on it. Winter had deepened. January now, the trails mostly empty, except for the hardcore adventurers who didn't mind bitter cold. The ranger station was closed for the season. The second thing he managed was movement. Not manifestation, not yet. But the ability to shift his awareness from place to place, to explore the ridge that had been his prison and territory for 2 centuries. He found evidence of Emma's rescue at Eagle Pass. Disturbed snow, emergency markers that hadn't been there before, signs that multiple people had moved through the area in organized fashion. Good. Chen had received his message. Sarah had reached the girl. They'd gotten her out. But where was Sarah? Nathaniel extended his awareness down the mountain, searching for that particular warmth he'd come to recognize as her presence. Nothing. The jeep wasn't in the parking lot. No photographer setting up shots at the scenic overlooks. No stubborn woman climbing dangerous heights to find a ghost who'd told her to leave him alone. She'd listened, finally. She'd saved Emma and gone home and let him dissolve into nothing, exactly as he'd suggested. This was good. This was right. This was what should have happened. So why did it feel like dying all over again? Nathaniel spent the next week pulling himself together by force of will and spite. The spite was mostly directed at Daniel's ghost, which had remained mercifully absent during his recovery, but would surely reappear the moment he achieved full consciousness. The will came from somewhere darker, the stubborn refusal to fade completely, the same quality that had kept him here for 200 years, when full death would have been easier. By late January, he could manifest again, not for long and not solidly, but enough to take form at Widow's Drop and watch the sun set over the valley. He stood in the place where he'd met Sarah, where she'd asked him to stay, where they'd made a deal about having a real conversation, a deal she'd apparently decided not to honor. "She's smarter than you gave her credit for," Daniel's voice said from behind him. The ghost appeared, looking as dead as ever, eyes still wide with that eternal moment of betrayal. "Saw what you were and ran." "She didn't run. She just moved on." Same thing. Nathaniel didn't argue. What was the point? Daniel was right. Sarah had gotten what she came for. A good story, maybe, or the satisfaction of saving Emma. But she'd recognized the impossibility of whatever connection they'd been building, and had the sense to end it before it became pathological. He should be grateful. Instead, he felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with being technically dead. The weeks blurred together. February arrived with a series of ice storms that made the trails impassable. Nathaniel wandered his mountain, watching from a distance as the few brave hikers who attempted the trek turned back within hours. He practiced manifesting, rebuilding his strength, trying not to think about coffee thermoses and direct gazes and someone who'd looked at him like he might be worth saving. It was the first week of March when Rebecca Harlow returned. Nathaniel sensed her approach with a mixture of dread and resignation. Rebecca was 61 now, 20 years older than when they'd last spoken. She climbed slowly, methodically, with the careful pace of someone who understood their body's new limitations. But she was climbing, which meant something had brought her back after 2 decades of denial. She stopped at Widow's Drop, their place, his and Sarah's, though Rebecca had no way of knowing that, and set down a worn leather satchel. Then she pulled out a very familiar thermos. Nathaniel materialized without thinking. "Where did you get that?" Rebecca didn't startle, just looked at him with tired eyes that had seen too much and explained away too little. "Sarah Mitchell gave it to me. Said I should bring it back to you." "When?" 2 months ago. She came to my house with a recorder and about 300 questions about the Frost Hollow settlement. Wanted to know everything I'd found, everything I'd dismissed, everything I'd been too scared to believe. Rebecca poured something from the thermos, coffee by the smell, into a battered cup. "She's writing a book." Nathaniel's form flickered. "About what?" "About you. About the mountain. About how we rationalize away the things that don't fit our understanding of reality." Rebecca took a sip, then met his eyes. "She asked me why I stopped coming up here." Why I wrote that book claiming everything was just folklore and misidentification. What did you tell her? The truth, that you terrified me. Not because you were dangerous, but because you were real. And that meant everything I'd built my career on was a comfortable lie. She set down the cup. I'm sorry, Nathaniel. I'm sorry I looked at your pain and decided it was easier to pretend it didn't exist than to sit with the discomfort of believing you. The apology landed strangely. Not unwelcome exactly, but 20 years too late to matter the way it might have once. Why are you telling me this now? Because Sarah wanted you to know she hasn't forgotten, that she hasn't run away. She's been researching, building a case, gathering evidence, and she wanted me to give you this. Rebecca pulled a book from her satchel and set it on the rock. It's not published yet. This is her draft manuscript. Nathaniel stared at the bound pages. I can't read it, can't hold it without... I know. Rebecca settled herself more comfortably on the rock. That's why I'm going to read it to you, if you want. He should say no, should dissolve back into the mountain and let Rebecca freeze on the ridge and let Sarah's book exist somewhere he'd never have to confront it. But he'd spent 2 centuries alone with his guilt, and Daniel's ghost, and the offer of connection, even this strange, mediated, impossible connection, was too tempting to refuse. Yes, he said, I want. Rebecca opened the book and began to read. The manuscript was titled The Mountain's Memory, Nathaniel Frost and the Weight of Atonement. It opened with Sarah's account of her fall, her rescue, her first conversation with a dead man who thought he deserved damnation. But it didn't stop there. Sarah had interviewed everyone, Thomas Chen about the mysterious message that had led him to Emma Kowalski, Emma herself, who swore she'd felt a presence keeping her warm until help arrived. Hikers who'd experienced unexplained saves on the mountain over the decades, a pushed camera bag that prevented a step onto unstable ground, a cold breeze that warned of approaching storms, a voice that called them back from dangerous shortcuts. She'd compiled incident reports going back 50 years, cross-referenced unexplained phenomena with survival rates on different trail systems, built a statistical case that Widow's Drop and the surrounding area had significantly fewer fatal accidents than comparable terrain in other parts of the Alleghenies. Someone has been protecting this mountain, Sarah had written, for far longer than official records exist. Someone who considers every life that enters his territory as a responsibility, not a threat. Someone who has saved dozens, possibly hundreds, while believing himself beyond redemption. Rebecca's voice cracked on that last line. She paused, looked at Nathaniel. She's right, you know. She's generous. She's thorough. There are 30 pages of footnoted research here. She tracked down descendants of the original Frost Hollow settlement, found journal entries from your father. Did you know he kept a journal? Nathaniel shook his head, unable to speak. He wrote about you and Daniel, about how proud he was that his sons wanted to build something new, something better, about how he worried you both tried too hard to take care of each other, how you competed over who could make the bigger sacrifice. Rebecca flipped through pages. Here, Nathaniel would give Daniel the shirt off his back and Daniel would freeze to death rather than accept it. I fear their love for each other is so fierce it will destroy them both. The words hit like bullets, accurate, devastating, impossible to defend against. His father had seen it, had understood the particular tragedy waiting to unfold, the way their devotion to each other had become weaponized by circumstance. Keep reading, Nathaniel managed. Rebecca continued through the manuscript. Sarah had interviewed descendants, historians, psychologists, folklorists. She'd built a framework for understanding hauntings not as random supernatural events, but as trauma imprinted on landscape, as grief that wouldn't let go, as love that outlasted death. But the final chapter was different, personal. It was addressed directly to Nathaniel. I know you'll probably never read this, Sarah had written, but I need to say it anyway. You asked me why I kept coming back, why I didn't run away after seeing what you are. The truth is, I see myself in you. Not the supernatural part. I'm depressingly mortal. But the part that punishes yourself for human failure. The part that turns a moment of weakness into a lifetime sentence. The part that can't forgive yourself for not being perfect when it mattered most. 3 years ago, I was driving home from an assignment. I'd been awake for 20 hours, pushing through exhaustion because I had a deadline. I fell asleep at the wheel. For 3 seconds, just 3 seconds, but that was enough. I crossed the center line. The car coming toward me swerved, overcorrected, hit a tree. The driver lived, but he'll never walk again. 26 years old, his whole life changed because I made the choice to keep driving instead of pulling over to rest. I spent a year in therapy, another year unable to get behind a wheel. I understand now that it was an accident, that I didn't intend harm, that beating myself up forever won't undo what happened. But some part of me will always be frozen in those 3 seconds, trying to make a different choice. Just like you've been frozen for 200 years in the moment you hesitated. The difference is, I had people who refused to let me disappear into guilt, who insisted I was more than my worst moment, who reminded me that spending the rest of my life punishing myself wouldn't help anyone. You haven't had that. You've had only the mountain and your brother's ghost and 2 centuries of isolation. So I'm writing this to tell you what no one else has. You deserve forgiveness, not because you didn't fail Daniel, you did, just like I failed that driver, but because you've spent 200 years trying to atone, trying to save others, trying to be better than the person you were in that moment of crisis. You've earned the right to rest, to be released, to forgive yourself. I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if the mountain will ever let you go, but I need you to know that you mattered to me, that the week I spent researching you, talking to people whose lives you've touched, understanding the weight you've carried, it changed something in me. You helped me forgive myself for my 3 seconds, so maybe, somehow, I can help you forgive yours. Rebecca closed the book. She left a few days ago, said she needed to hike the Pacific Crest Trail to clear her head before the book launches, but she made me promise to come up here, to read this to you. Nathaniel couldn't respond. His entire being felt crystallized around Sarah's words, around the impossible gift she'd given him, understanding, not absolution, she was too honest for that, but recognition that 200 years of atonement might be enough, that he might be enough. She left you something else, Rebecca said. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a photograph. She said if you could manifest solid enough to hold it, you should keep it. If not, I'm supposed to leave it here. She set the photograph on the rock, weighted down by a smaller stone. Nathaniel drifted closer, letting his form solidify enough to see clearly. The image showed Widow's Drop at sunset, golden light painting the valley below. But in the corner, barely visible in the mountain mist, was a figure. Him. Sarah had captured him on film, or digital sensor, whatever cameras used now, and the result was haunting. He looked almost human, almost real, almost like someone who deserved to exist. I can't hold it, Nathaniel said, his voice rough, not without it costing too much. Then I'll leave it here, maybe someday. Rebecca stood, gathering her things. She really cares about you, you know. Spent 2 months researching you, another month writing. That's not just academic interest. She's alive, I'm not. That's an insurmountable problem. Is it? Or is that just another excuse to keep punishing yourself? Rebecca shouldered her satchel. I'm too old and too tired to make the same mistake twice, Nathaniel. 20 years ago, I looked at the impossible and chose to deny it. I'm not doing that again. You're real. Your pain is real. And what Sarah feels for you, that's real too. The question is whether you're brave enough to accept that reality. She left before he could answer, picking her way carefully down the trail in the fading light. Nathaniel stayed at Widow's Drop, staring at the photograph, at his own captured image. He looked solid in the picture, present, like someone who belonged in the world instead of haunting its margins. Daniel's ghost appeared, right on schedule. She's wrong, you know, about all of it. Maybe. There's no maybe. You killed me. 200 years doesn't change that. Nathaniel turned to face his brother's ghost, or his manifestation of guilt, or whatever Daniel actually was. I hesitated. For 3 seconds. And you died. I've accepted that. I'll carry it forever. But Sarah's right about one thing. I've also saved lives, warned people, protected this mountain. That doesn't erase what I did to you, but it has to count for something. It counts for nothing. You're still here, still trapped, still punished. Because I choose to be. The realization arrived with the force of revelation. The mountain didn't trap me. My guilt did. You... He gestured at Daniel's ghost. You're not even really Daniel, are you? You're just the part of me that won't let go, that insists I don't deserve peace. The ghost flickered, and for a moment, Nathaniel saw something different underneath. Not Daniel's betrayed face, but his own, distorted by grief and rage and self-hatred. If I let you go, I lose the only thing that makes sense of your death. My death didn't make sense. It was random, tragic, the result of desperation and bad luck, and two brothers who loved each other trying to survive an impossible winter. You can't atone for that. You can only grieve it. I don't know how. The admission came from both of them, Nathaniel and the ghost, which was also Nathaniel, which had always been Nathaniel talking to himself across 2 centuries of isolation. They stared at each other, dead man and manifestation of guilt, and for the first time Nathaniel felt the possibility of something breaking. Sarah figured out how to grieve her 3 seconds, he said slowly. Maybe I can figure out how to grieve mine. And if you do, if you forgive yourself. The ghost's voice was smaller now, less certain. What happens to me? I don't know. Nathaniel looked down at the photograph, at Sarah's gift. But I think I'm ready to find out. The ghost dissolved slowly, not with Daniel's usual dramatic exit, but with something quieter, sadder, more final. And Nathaniel realized what he'd really been afraid of all these years. Not eternal punishment, but the moment when the punishment ended and he'd have to figure out who he was without it. He spent the rest of March learning, not how to manifest or affect the physical world, he'd mastered those skills centuries ago, but how to exist without the constant weight of guilt defining every moment. How to watch hikers pass through his territory without seeing each one as a potential failure to atone for. How to remember Daniel as his brother, complicated, flawed, human, instead of as a saint he'd murdered. It was harder than 200 years of punishment had been. Easier too. Strange how both could be true. April arrived with unexpected warmth. The trails opened early, and with them came the first wave of spring hikers. Nathaniel watched them from his dispersed state, no longer feeling the compulsion to track every movement, to prevent every possible harm. He'd spent 2 centuries trying to save everyone. Maybe it was time to trust that people could save themselves. Then, on April 3rd, he felt Sarah return. She climbed slowly, stopping often to photograph the wildflowers just beginning to bloom. Nathaniel watched from a distance, unsure whether to appear. She'd said her goodbyes through Rebecca and the book. She'd given him the tools to start healing. Maybe that was all this was meant to be. A brief intersection of living and dead that changed them both before moving on. But Sarah went straight to Widow's Drop. She set down her pack and pulled out the thermos, the same one battered from months of use, and poured coffee into 2 cups. Then she sat down and waited. Nathaniel manifested slowly, carefully. He appeared less solid than usual, conserving strength, unsure how long he could maintain form. Sarah smiled when she saw him, and the expression was so genuine that Nathaniel felt something in his chest that might have been his heart, if he still had one. "I finished the book," Sarah said, pushing 1 coffee cup toward him, even though they both knew he couldn't drink it. "It launches in June. My publisher thinks we might have something special. Rebecca read it to me, all of it." "Even the last chapter?" "Especially the last chapter." Nathaniel settled across from her, the early spring sun passing through his form without warmth. "You didn't have to do that. The research, the book, the..." He gestured helplessly. "Any of it. I know. But I wanted to. You saved my life, Nathaniel. You deserved someone doing the work to save yours, or whatever this is. I'm still dead. But you're not damned. Not anymore, are you?" He considered the question carefully. The weight that had pressed on him for 2 centuries felt lighter now, almost bearable. Daniel's ghost hadn't appeared in weeks. The mountain still held him, but it felt less like a prison and more like home. I don't know what I am, but I think I'm starting to accept it. That's something. They sat in comfortable silence while Sarah drank her coffee and Nathaniel watched the valley wake under spring light. Finally, she asked, "What happens now?" "I don't know. I've never gotten this far before. Can you leave? Try to move beyond the mountain?" Nathaniel extended his awareness, testing the boundaries of his existence. He could spread himself across the ridge, thin himself to almost nothing, concentrate into solid form, but he couldn't imagine existing anywhere else. The mountain was woven into him now, or he was woven into it. "I don't think so. This is where I died, where I'm bound. So you're here forever." "It appears so." Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly, that same unwavering gaze that had made him stay the first time. "Then I guess I'll have to keep coming back. Someone needs to make sure you don't spend another 200 years alone." "Sarah, I'm not asking for promises, Nathaniel. I'm not asking you to be something you can't be. But I like talking to you. I like the version of myself I am when I'm here. And I think maybe you like having someone to talk to who isn't your own guilt manifesting as your dead brother." Despite everything, despite being dead, despite 2 centuries of isolation, despite the impossibility of whatever she was offering, Nathaniel laughed. The sound startled a crow from a nearby tree, sent it winging into blue sky. "You're ridiculous." "I'm persistent. There's a difference." She started packing up her things. "I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm covering the spring wildflower bloom for a magazine. And then in June for the book launch. There's going to be a reading at the county library. You should try to make it." "I can't leave the mountain." "I know. But the library's at the base of the ridge. Maybe you could stretch that far, just for an hour." "Maybe." The possibility felt both terrifying and thrilling, to be present for something, to be acknowledged publicly instead of existing in secret. "I'll try." Sarah shouldered her pack but paused before leaving. "Nathaniel, that photograph I left, did you look at it?" "Yes." "Did you see what I saw?" He thought about the image, about how solid he'd appeared in the mountain mist. "I saw someone who might deserve to exist." "Good, that's a start." She headed down the trail but called back over her shoulder. "And Nathaniel, next time I'm bringing better coffee. That instant stuff is an insult to both the living and the dead." He watched her descend until she disappeared into the tree line, then turned his attention to the photograph still weighted on the rock. Gathering his strength, knowing it would cost him, Nathaniel reached for it. The contact burned. The physical effort sent cracks spiderwebbing through his manifestation. But he held on long enough to lift the photograph, to truly look at the image Sarah had captured. And for the first time in 234 years, Nathaniel Frost saw himself as something other than a monster, or a ghost, or a mistake. He saw someone who'd made a terrible choice in an impossible moment and had spent centuries trying to make it right. Someone who'd failed his brother but saved dozens of strangers. Someone who'd earned, through accumulated small acts of protection and witness, the possibility of forgiveness. Someone who might, just maybe, deserve a second chance. The photograph slipped from his fingers as his form gave out, the effort too much to maintain. But he'd held it. He'd touched it. He'd made contact with the world in a way that felt like choice instead of desperation. As Nathaniel dissolved back into the mountain, not fleeing, just resting, he found himself looking forward to something. To Sarah's return in 2 weeks. To her terrible instant coffee, and her direct questions and her refusal to let him hide behind 2 centuries of self-imposed exile. To the possibility that the mountain might keep him, but loneliness didn't have to. Daniel's ghost didn't appear that night, or the next. Slowly, Nathaniel began to understand he'd finally said goodbye. Not to his brother's memory, that would stay forever cherished and painful and real, but to the manifestation of guilt that had worn his brother's face for 200 years. To the voice that insisted punishment was the only path, that atonement was impossible, that he deserved nothing but endless isolation. Sarah returned in 2 weeks, as promised, then again in 3, then with increasing frequency as spring deepened into summer. She brought coffee and cameras and stories about the living world. She read him reviews of her book, some glowing, some skeptical, all fascinated by the idea of a journalist who'd actually found the ghost she was writing about. And Nathaniel found himself looking forward to these visits, to the rhythm of shared silence and conversation. He practiced manifesting more solidly, extending the time he could maintain form. Sarah brought him a stone she'd found with a perfect fossil pressed into its surface, and he held it for almost a minute before the effort became too much. "You're getting stronger," she observed, "or just more motivated." He handed back the stone, his form flickering with the effort. "Does it still hurt? When you touch things?" "Yes, but it's worth it." Summer brought the book launch. Sarah had been right. The county library sat at the base of the ridge, just barely within Nathaniel's territory. The night of the reading, he stretched himself thin as thought, spreading his awareness down the mountain until he could perceive the small crowd gathered in the community room. Thomas Chen was there, Rebecca Harlow, Emma Kowalski, walking with only a slight limp. Hikers he'd saved over the decades, most of them unaware of what had protected them. And Sarah standing at a podium, reading from the final chapter about 3 seconds of hesitation and 200 years of atonement. Nathaniel couldn't manifest fully. The distance was too great, the effort too costly. But he made himself known in small ways. The lights flickered. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees, and when Sarah reached the part about forgiveness, about earning the right to rest, a gentle breeze moved through the closed space, carrying the scent of pine and mountain air. Sarah looked up from her pages, looked directly at where Nathaniel wasn't quite visible, and smiled. That night, as Nathaniel retreated to his mountain, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 centuries. Contentment. Not happiness. That felt too presumptuous for someone still technically dead, but a quiet satisfaction that his existence meant something, that his story mattered, that his efforts to atone had been witnessed and acknowledged. He thought about Sarah's 3 seconds at the wheel, about his 3 seconds with Daniel and the musket, and the choice that had defined 200 years, about how human life was built from these tiny moments that branched into infinite consequences, and how the only thing anyone could do was try to make the next moment better than the last. Nathaniel had made countless moments better over 2 centuries. He'd saved lives, prevented tragedies, borne witness to the mountain stories. And now, finally, he could add one more thing to that ledger. He'd let himself be saved. Not in the way Sarah had been saved from falling. There was no rescue from death, no second chance at life, but saved from the crushing weight of believing his worst moment defined him. Saved from the isolation that had made punishment feel like justice. Saved from the idea that atonement meant suffering forever instead of learning to be better. The mountain still held him. Death still claimed him. Daniel was still gone, and that grief would never fully heal. But Nathaniel Frost, mountain wraith of the Pennsylvania Alleghenies, had finally learned the difference between damnation and penance, between punishment and growth, between existing and living. And if he couldn't be alive, at least now he could be present, could maintain the relationships he'd built, with Sarah, with the hikers who would read the book and come searching, with the mountain itself that had been both prison and home for so long. Could be, in his own strange way, part of the world again. Sarah kept returning. Through summer into fall, as the leaves turned gold and crimson and the first frost kissed the high ridge. She brought news of the book's success, of interviews and speaking engagements and people who wanted to hear about the wraith who'd learned to forgive himself. She brought other things too, new coffee, because she'd meant it about the instant stuff being an insult. Stories about her life, about learning to drive again without panic, about the scholarship fund she'd established in the name of the man she'd injured with her 3 seconds of sleep, and Nathaniel shared what he could. Stories from 200 years of observation, small miracles and quiet tragedies, the accumulated wisdom of watching countless lives begin and end on his mountain. He got better at manifesting, at maintaining solid form for longer periods. They never touched. The cost was still too high, the pain too sharp. But they sat across from each other at Widow's Drop as the seasons turned, as alive and dead found a way to coexist in the space between. On the anniversary of his death, January 17th, Sarah climbed through bitter cold to bring him coffee and companionship. She didn't mention the date, didn't make it significant. just sat with him as snow began to fall, drinking warmth while he watched the flakes pass through his form without melting. "Do you ever wish it was different?" she asked. "That you could be alive again?" Nathaniel considered the question carefully. A year ago he would have said yes without hesitation. 200 years ago he would have begged for it. But now, sitting across from someone who saw him, truly saw him, not just the guilt or the curse, but the person trying to do better, he found a different answer. "I wish I could hold your hand without it costing us both," he said. "I wish I could walk down that mountain with you and meet you for coffee somewhere that isn't freezing. I wish I could age alongside you, experience time the way you do instead of watching it pass." He paused. "But if the choice is between being alive without having met you or being this with you here, I choose this." Sarah's eyes gleamed with something that might have been tears. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, and it's deeply tragic that it came from a dead man. I contain multitudes. You contain bad jokes, there's a difference." They sat together as snow accumulated on the rocks around them, as the valley below disappeared under white, as the mountain settled into its winter sleep. And Nathaniel Frost, who had spent 200 years alone with his guilt, felt something that might have been peace, not an ending. He would be here long after Sarah's visit stopped, after her life continued into places he couldn't follow, after whatever came next. But a beginning, a chance to exist as something more than punishment, more than curse, more than the worst moment of his life eternalized. A chance to be witnessed, to be known, to matter. And in the end, after 234 years of isolation, that was enough. Winter deepened. The trails closed. Sarah's visits became less frequent, monthly instead of weekly, dictated by weather and safety rather than choice. Nathaniel didn't mind. He'd learned patience centuries ago, and knowing she would return when the conditions allowed was different from the endless uncertainty of before. He spent the quiet months practicing, manifesting more solidly, holding form for longer periods, extending his awareness down the mountain, testing the boundaries of where he could exist. He would never leave the ridge, that much was clear, but perhaps he could be more present in the world that touched his territory. In late February, Emma Kowalski returned. She was 17 now, walking with confidence on the leg that had been broken. Nathaniel watched her climb to Eagle Pass, watched her stop at the exact spot where Sarah had found her, where she'd waited for rescue, while something kept her warm. "I know you're here," Emma said to the empty air. "Sarah's book said you might be. I wanted to thank you for that night." Nathaniel manifested carefully, not wanting to frighten her. Emma's eyes widened, but she didn't run, just stared at the spectral figure before her with the same directness Sarah had shown. "You're real," she breathed. "I thought maybe I'd imagined, but you're real." "Real enough," Nathaniel agreed. "How's your leg?" "Better. Physical therapy sucked, but I'm back to hiking. Thought about quitting after the accident, but," she shrugged, "seemed wrong to let fear win." "That's wise." Emma pulled off her backpack and extracted something wrapped in cloth. "I brought you something. Sarah said you can hold things if you try hard enough, even though it hurts." She unwrapped a compass, old brass, with a cracked glass face and a needle that still pointed true. "It belonged to my great-great-grandfather. He surveyed these mountains in the 1880s. Sarah said you've been here since way before that, but I thought, I don't know. Maybe it's weird, giving a ghost a compass." "I'm not a ghost," Nathaniel said automatically, but he was staring at the compass, at the offered gift. "Why would you give me something so precious?" "Because you saved my life. Because according to Sarah's research, you've saved a lot of lives. And because maybe having something from the living world would make you feel less—" She searched for words. "Less stuck." Nathaniel reached for the compass. The contact burned as expected, pain shooting through his spectral form. But he held on, wrapping translucent fingers around brass warm from Emma's pocket. The needle spun wildly for a moment, then settled, pointing north with absolute certainty. "Thank you," he managed, before the effort became too much and he had to release it. Emma set the compass on a flat rock, positioning it carefully. "I'll leave it here. Maybe someday you'll be able to hold it longer." She left, and Nathaniel stayed with the compass, watching the needle point its eternal north. A gift from the living, an acknowledgement that his existence mattered, a reminder that saving lives meant something beyond atonement, beyond punishment, beyond the cycle of guilt he'd been trapped in. March brought Sarah with news. The book had been optioned for a documentary. A film crew wanted to come to the mountain to capture the location, to interview survivors. "I told them you probably wouldn't appear on camera," she said, "but they want to try anyway." A documentary. About the mountain, about you, about how places hold memory and how that memory can become protective instead of punitive. She paused. "You don't have to be part of it. I can tell them no." Nathaniel thought about it, about being known, being public, being examined by people who would try to explain him away or sensationalize his existence, about the risk of becoming a story instead of a person. But he also thought about Emma's compass, about Rebecca's apology, about all the people who'd been touched by his story and found meaning in it, about how isolation had nearly destroyed him and connection had begun to heal him. "I'll think about it," he said. The documentary crew arrived in April. Nathaniel stayed dispersed, watching from a distance as they set up cameras at Widow's Drop, as they interviewed Sarah and Thomas Chen and Emma and a dozen others. He listened to them tell their stories, heard his own actions reflected back through the lens of lives he'd impacted. On the final day of filming, as the crew was packing equipment, Nathaniel made a choice. He manifested at the edge of their camera frame, not fully, not solidly, but enough to appear on film as something, a shimmer in the air, a cold spot that registered on their temperature sensors, a presence that made the footage flicker and the sound equipment pick up whispers in an accent from 1790. The director saw the playback and went pale. Did we just?" Sarah smiled. "I told you the mountain had stories." They ran the footage over and over, slowing it down, enhancing it, analyzing every frame. And there, in the periphery of the shot, was Nathaniel. Not quite solid, not quite visible, but undeniably present. Proof that Sarah's book wasn't just journalism or creative writing, but documentation of something real. The documentary premiered in June, the same month Sarah's book had launched the year before. Nathaniel watched from his mountain as it sparked conversations, as people debated what they'd seen on the footage, as scientists and spiritualists and skeptics all tried to explain or dismiss him. But more importantly, he watched as it brought people to the mountain. Not ghost hunters or thrill seekers, but people who'd experienced their own 3 seconds of failure, their own impossible choices, their own crushing guilt. They came searching for proof that atonement was possible, that mistakes didn't have to define forever, that beings who'd done terrible things could still do good. And Nathaniel realized this was why he'd stayed, not as punishment, but as witness. To show that death wasn't the end of growing, that isolation wasn't the only response to guilt, that even cursed existences could accumulate meaning. Sarah visited less frequently now. Her career had exploded, speaking engagements, a second book, consulting work with paranormal researchers. But when she came, they fell into their established rhythm: coffee, conversation, comfortable silence. She was 30 now, Nathaniel noted. Lines appearing at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting through camera viewfinders. He would never age, would always appear 32, would always carry the musketball wound in his chest. The asymmetry should have bothered him. Instead, he found it oddly comforting. Sarah would grow, change, eventually move beyond him. She would live her full life, make her full impact on the world. And Nathaniel would be here, watching over the mountain, protecting the hikers who came, bearing witness to the passage of time. It was enough. On a bright October afternoon, 2 years after they'd met, Sarah climbed to Widow's Drop with something different in her expression. Not sad exactly, but weighted with something she'd been holding. "I'm getting married," she said without preamble. Nathaniel felt the information land somewhere in his chest. "Congratulations." "His name is Michael. He's a photographer too. We met at a gallery opening for my mountain series." She was talking too fast, the words tumbling out. "He knows about you, about this. I told him everything, And he understands that I'll keep coming back here, that you're important to me. Good. That's good, Sarah. And he meant it, even though the news hurt in ways he couldn't fully explain. You deserve happiness. Real, living, growing old together happiness. I know. She met his eyes. But I needed to tell you, needed you to hear it from me and know that this doesn't change. She gestured between them. Whatever this is. I know what this is. Nathaniel's form solidified, becoming more present than he'd been in weeks. You're my connection to the world, my reminder that I matter, my proof that 200 years of trying to do better actually meant something, and my reminder that 3 seconds don't define a life, Sarah finished. My proof that guilt can be survived, transformed, even used for good. They sat together as the sun tracked west, as the valley filled with golden light. Finally, Sarah asked, "Will you come to the wedding? Michael wants to meet you, and the ceremony will be at the base of the mountain. I think you could reach that far if you tried." "I'll try," Nathaniel promised. The wedding was in November, on a clear day when the mountain wore its finest autumn colors. Nathaniel stretched himself thin, spreading his consciousness down to the small chapel that sat at the edge of his territory. He couldn't manifest fully, the distance was too great, but he made himself felt in small ways. The temperature dropped 5 degrees when Sarah walked down the aisle. The candles flickered in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. And when the officiant spoke about the mysteries that bind people together across impossible distances, a breeze moved through the closed room, carrying the scent of pine. Sarah smiled, knowing. And later, during the reception, she raised a glass in a toast that confused most of the guests, to the mountain and to the friends we find in unexpected places. Michael, to his credit, raised his glass too. "To Nathaniel," he said clearly, "for saving my wife's life before I even knew she existed." That night, as Nathaniel retreated to his ridge, to the place where he'd died and been reborn into this strange half-existence, he felt something he'd never expected. Happiness. Not the desperate, grasping kind that came from trying to hold on to what couldn't be kept, but the quiet, settled kind that came from knowing his existence had value, that his story had meaning, that even the dead could forge connections that mattered. Years passed. Sarah visited less frequently, once a month, then every few months, then only on special occasions. She had children, 2 girls who she brought to the mountain when they were old enough to appreciate its beauty and understand its significance. Nathaniel watched them grow, these tiny humans who would never know him, but who existed partly because he'd saved their mother's life. The documentary became a series. Researchers came to study the phenomenon, bringing equipment that detected cold spots and electromagnetic fluctuations, and things Nathaniel didn't fully understand. He cooperated sometimes, manifesting for their instruments, providing evidence that something existed beyond conventional explanation. But mostly, he did what he'd always done, watched over the mountain, protected the hikers who came, bore witness to the small dramas of life that played out on his territory. Each rescue felt less like atonement and more like choice now. Each intervention wasn't because he owed the mountain or the universe or Daniel's memory, but because he could help, so he did. Rebecca Harlow passed in her sleep at 73. Nathaniel felt her go, felt the small disturbance in the mountain's energy as a life that had touched his ended. He manifested at her funeral, barely, just a cold presence at the back of the church, and listened to Sarah deliver the eulogy. Heard her talk about Rebecca's courage in finally acknowledging the truth, in choosing belief over comfortable denial. Thomas Chen retired and moved south, but not before hiking to Widow's Drop one last time to thank the presence he'd never quite seen but had learned to trust. Emma Kowalski became a park ranger, dedicating her career to the mountains that had almost killed her, but instead taught her about resilience and mystery. And Sarah grew older gracefully, her hair silvering, her face mapping the years in lines Nathaniel came to know by heart. She still climbed the mountain, though less frequently, often with Michael beside her now. They would sit at Widow's Drop, and Michael would photograph while Sarah told Nathaniel stories about their life, about their children, about the world that continued to spin without him. "Do you ever regret it?" Michael asked once during one of these visits. "Being stuck here?" Nathaniel considered the question. 20 years ago he would have said yes. 200 years ago he would have begged for release. But now, with decades of connection and meaning and purpose accumulated like interest in a bank account he'd never expected to access, "No," he said, "this is where I belong." On the 30th anniversary of saving Sarah's life, she climbed the mountain alone, 78 years old now, moving slowly but determinedly. She told Michael she needed to do this one last time while she still could, while her legs could still carry her to the ridge. Nathaniel manifested fully to meet her, pulling himself into the most solid form he'd managed in decades. The effort was tremendous, but he wanted her to see him clearly this one last time. "You look the same," Sarah said, settling onto their rock with a groan. "I'm jealous." "You look perfect," Nathaniel replied. "Every year suits you." "Liar." But she smiled. "I brought something." She handed him a book, her latest hot off the press. The Widow's Drop chronicles 30 years with Pennsylvania's mountain wraith. The dedication read, "For Nathaniel Frost, who taught me that the dead can be more alive than the living." Nathaniel held the book carefully, marveling at the weight of it, at the accumulated years it represented. "You've documented 3 decades of conversations with a ghost who insists he's not a ghost." Someone had to. Sarah looked out over the valley, at the view they'd shared for 30 years. "I wanted you to know I'm not going to be able to make this climb much longer. My doctor says my heart can't handle the altitude anymore." The information landed like a stone in still water. "I understand. But I've arranged for others to come. Emma has agreed to visit monthly, and my daughter Claire, she's a photographer too. She wants to document you the way I did, wants to know your story firsthand." Sarah turned to look at him. "You won't be alone again, I've made sure of that." "Sarah," Nathaniel's voice cracked, "you've given me more than I deserved, more than I ever expected. You don't owe me anything else. I'm not doing this because I owe you. I'm doing it because you matter, because your existence matters, because the world is better with you in it, even if you're technically not in it the way the rest of us are." She reached toward him, stopped just before contact. "Thank you for saving my life, for teaching me about forgiveness, for being here year after year, keeping watch. Thank you," Nathaniel said, "for seeing me, for making me believe I was worth seeing." They sat together as the sun set, as they had hundreds of times before, and when Sarah finally stood to make the descent, carefully with hiking poles now, Nathaniel walked her to the edge of his territory. As far as he could go, which was just far enough to see her reach the parking lot, to watch her turn back one last time and wave. He waved back, knowing she couldn't see the gesture clearly from that distance, but making it anyway. Claire came the next month, as promised, and Emma and others, journalists, researchers, people whose lives had been touched by Sarah's books and wanted to know more. Nathaniel greeted them all, shared what he could, became something that surprised him. Not a curse or a warning or a tragic figure, but a teacher. Someone who'd learned through 2 centuries of existence how to carry guilt without being crushed by it, how to atone without self-destruction, how to find meaning in the strangest circumstances. Sarah passed 5 years later, surrounded by family. Nathaniel felt it, a warmth leaving the world, a light going out. But he felt something else too. Gratitude. Not from her. The dead didn't send messages, at least not the truly dead. But from himself. Gratitude that she'd existed, that their paths had crossed, that she'd refused to let him remain invisible. At her funeral, Claire read from the final entry in Sarah's journal. "If there's anything after this, I hope I get to tell Nathaniel that he was wrong. He wasn't a mistake that wouldn't die. He was a gift that wouldn't quit. And I was lucky to receive it." The mountain held Nathaniel through his grief, not as a prison now, but as the only place that made sense, the only home he'd known for 2.5 centuries. He continued his vigil, protecting hikers, warning the reckless, bearing witness to the endless cycle of life that touched his territory. Seasons turned, years accumulated. The world changed in ways Nathaniel couldn't have imagined. Technology advancing, climate shifting, even the mountain itself slowly wearing under the weight of time. But some things remained constant. The sunrise over the valley, the way snow settled on pines, the particular silence of a mountain morning before the world woke. And Nathaniel Frost remained. Not as punishment anymore, not as curse or guilt or eternal damnation, but as guardian, as witness, as proof that even the dead could grow, could change, could find purpose in the strangest circumstances. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the mountain slept and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Nathaniel would think about Daniel. Not the ghost of guilt he'd carried for so long, but the real brother he'd loved and lost. He'd think about those 3 seconds that had changed everything, and he'd finally let himself feel the grief without the guilt. Just loss, just love, just the human ache of missing someone who couldn't be brought back. And in those moments, Nathaniel would swear he felt something like forgiveness settling over him. Not from the mountain or Daniel or even himself. Just the natural passage of time, smoothing sharp edges, the way water wore stone, the way years accumulated into wisdom. He was still here, still bound to these ridges, still technically dead, but he was no longer damned. And after 250 years, Nathaniel Frost finally understood that was enough. That had always been enough. He just needed Sarah Mitchell to fall off a cliff and demand he stay to finally figure it out. The mountain held him. The stars wheeled overhead. Life continued in all its messy, beautiful, impossible complexity. And Nathaniel kept watch, no longer alone, no longer trapped, no longer defined by his worst moment. Just a wraith on a mountain, protecting what he could, bearing witness to what he couldn't, and finding meaning in the simple fact of his continued existence. It was enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't known how to see it until someone saw him first.